I've been working on add-ons lately to use SVGs to bring extra information into Blender. And I want to take a moment aside in order to go through all the things I've learned about SVGs in Blender, why you should care, and some different quirks I've run into. Um, so real quick, the reason SVGs are special is because they carry a lot of information and they're done as vectors. So a vector image you can bring in at any size and it's going to keep its shape, right? Whereas an image, a regular image plane, it's going to start pixelating pretty quickly when you start blowing it up. So until you bring something in as a vector, you're always going to run into things like that. So, traditionally people might trace a raster image into a vector in order to work with it. But you're still going to have to bring it into Blender at some point, and that's where SVGs come in. SVGs are already set up as vectors, similar to how Blender already works. But then there's lots of issues on trying to make it work well. So the first issue we're going to talk about is element IDs. So if you're familiar at all with XML or HTML or the way that files are laid out in certain file formats, they have these tags, and each tag represents an element, and they can have these properties. So when you have a path, each one of these represents a different point, and M will move it somewhere, and then it can move around, and kind of treats it like pencil up, pencil down type movements. And when you import these into Blender, each one of these gets pulled in as a separate curve, right? Like this, it'll say path, and that'll match the ID that is in the file. The problem is that a lot of applications don't have this ID at all. They treat it as optional unless it's at a layer. I believe they will always have a layer ID. But you don't want to put everything into separate layers in order to have distinct names in Blender. All of these ones that have the dot and a number are ones that I've created in the add-on I've been working on. But without them, it's really hard to match anything that's inside the file and what is imported in Blender, unless you do something like that and you can use that to reference. The next thing I've run into is hierarchy. So the way that Blender pulls everything in, it doesn't matter what layer something is in, everything will get pulled in all in just one layer, right? Because I don't know if it's because they didn't want to have the concept of layers in here, but obviously they've got collections, but the standard Blender import doesn't respect any of that hierarchy when it comes to collections and layers and stuff like that. It just pulls everything into one collection titled by the file name. So I do have an update for this that allows hierarchy to be pulled in according to the layers in the file. So if you've got a layer which they're labeled as tags with G in here, I think I've got a couple layers. But if you've got one called layer 1, then it'll pull it in as layer 1. Let's see if I can make it work real quick. Right. So you can see here I've got the layers that are inside the file are now inside of Blender, which can be useful if you've organized your stuff in a way that you'd like to also bring into Blender. The next issue I've run into is styles not coming in properly. So I did this file in Vectornator, and I did not intend for it to be this bluish gray that you can barely see as a fill. And it's got some other issues here, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but the styles is what I'm going to mention right now. If a element comes in with a style tag like this, style equals, and then it's got, a fill or something like that, it will bring it in. And there's some files that do that. However, modern applications, in order to save space and have less redundancy, have standardized on having classes. So it'll say class, it'll name the class, and then this class will be inside of the larger styles for the entire file. And you can find the class here, and then it says what fill color it should be. But these are not getting imported into Blender in the same way that it would if it was written as a style property for that element. This is something else that I'll add. This will be fairly quick for me to do, but want people to be aware of that issue. Something else to be aware of is, besides styles not showing up, the only style that really is applicable are fills, because in Blender we're going to be working with mostly polygons, and curves don't really have any dimensionality unless you give them some thickness somehow. At which point now it's a fill again, right? There's no stroke color. If you come in here and you import a SVG as grease pencil, then you've got a stroke color. And it might make a little more sense, but I've found these to be a little sloppy. I didn't like the way they came in. I would prefer to bring them in as a curve, even if I'm going to make it grease pencil later. The next big issue that I've run into is a lot of the text that I brought in from applications like Vectorinator they'll just come in all scrambled like this, and it's really disappointing. And it's not only text, but text is an easy example of it. So I thought it was a limitation in Blender, but it's actually a weird way that some of these text elements are created. There's no optimization for overlapping vertices and weird connections that a user in those apps might do. So what I found was, if I come in here and I put it in the mesh view, I'm able to see exactly how the shape is being interpreted according to the vertices. And you saw how it had a piece way out in the middle there, and you can kind of untangle the web a little bit, and you'll start to get your recognizable shape back. So it takes a little bit of fiddling. Of course, if everything came from the same exact app, then you can copy this. If you've got multiple E's, for example. But even if it's not text, you can go in and work with it like this and improve the results of what you're seeing in Blender. And again, if you go to this mesh, the wireframe view, it's a little easier to see what's going on. The edges will point you in the direction of where some of the problems are at. I don't know a good way to automatically fix this. We may be stuck with these kind of issues for a while, but there is this workaround. I hope that helps. Real briefly, I wanted to mention that there is a way to export SVGs from Blender. It's called Freestyle. So it's like any other add-on. You just come in here, you can type in Freestyle, and you can find that. It's a little quirky. It does say that it's experimental, and things like fills and colors are going to be iffy. But it will give you line drawings from whatever camera perspective, so you can do 3D things, and then it'll give you SVG lines. You could color them in another application, and it is going to have some similar issues to the imports, where it's difficult to match up what was what between the elements in the SVG and Blender. Like I said, there's the color issues similar to the styles being imported, but the utility is there for anybody that wants to use it. Lastly, I just wanted to reiterate why we might actually care about being able to do this stuff with SVGs inside of Blender. And that's because we can actually bring things in as geometry, convert them to objects, edit them, just be able to mess around with them in ways that we would not be able to in a raster image. So I've got this weird shape here. If I want to remove components of it, that's not an issue. If I want to extrude something, give something thickness, I actually set this up to be a profile of this one so that they can interact with each other. All of those things are possible in SVGs that you would not be able to do in a raster image. Also, let's say you have the same exact image and you can have it as an SVG or convert it to PNG and not have any of these issues. I can understand why that would be tempting. But something that is unique to being able to messing with the SVGs is you can do things like select an entire group and remove it, or let's select an entire group and move it, right? Or just start separating things and keep them in this format that's easy to mess around with. And I don't want people to lose sight of the cool aspect of what you can do with SVGs just because it's pretty quirky inside of Blender, and then there's issues in working with them together. Because this kind of functionality is pretty cool, and I think is both in line with what Blender should be. So we try to keep things non-destructive and work with stuff and rework it, iterate, and SVG is kind of the same way. You can always change your layers and hide things, and work on the background when you hide the foreground, stuff like that. And they're pretty complementary when you work with them together. You just have to get through some of those issues I mentioned. So some of that stuff is going to be exploited and fixed and all that kind of stuff in the add-ons I've been working on for I'm calling Spec.io. But aside from that, I wanted to give some general information on SVGs and Blender. I hope you found it useful, and I'll talk to you guys next time.